My wife did not betray me. We went to a resort where she wanted to swing with another couple in love. Because of this, we went to a psychologist. Last weekend, my wife Jenna came rushing up to me, excitement gleaming in her eyes as she waved a sleek, glossy brochure in front of me. "A free luxury getaway," she exclaimed, barely able to contain her joy. The brochure showcased a stunning new resort perched on the Gulf Coast, promising elegance, indulgence, and relaxation. Immediately, skepticism crept into my mind. It looked expensive, beyond anything we would normally splurge on. But before I could voice my doubts, Jenna explained that her marketing firm was handling the resort's publicity. As a perk, they offered her a free stay for the weekend, and it would be a great opportunity for us to reconnect and spend some quality time together. It was an offer that seemed too good to pass up. At first, I hesitated. My friends and I had planned to watch a soccer game that Saturday, and part of me wasn't too keen on abandoning that. But then, seeing the excitement in Jenna's face and thinking back on how strained our relationship had been lately, I reconsidered. We had been married for 8 years, and though we were deeply in love, the stress from my construction business had taken its toll. Financial difficulties had forced us to sell our house, and though business was finally improving, we hadn't had much time for each other. Maybe this getaway was exactly what we needed, a chance to unwind, relax, and maybe rebuild some of the intimacy that had been lost amid the chaos of our everyday lives. Jenna works as a vice president at a successful PR firm in Orlando, and her job had been the cornerstone of our financial survival during the recent recession. Her rising career helped keep us afloat when my business hit its rough patches. But that success came with a cost: late nights, work trips, and a lot of time spent apart. As her career soared, it felt like our connection had started to drift. The long hours she put into her job meant that, more often than not, we were like two ships passing in the night, and our relationship was beginning to feel more like a partnership in managing household logistics rather than a marriage. So, I decided to push aside my reluctance about the soccer game. We packed our bags on Wednesday night and hit the road early Thursday morning. The drive to the resort was longer than I had expected, winding through rural backroads and dense, sprawling greenery. As we drove deeper into the remote landscape, I began to wonder how such a secluded place could attract the kind of high-end clientele that the brochure promised. But my doubts melted away as soon as we arrived. The resort was breathtaking. Nestled between palm trees and overlooking a shimmering stretch of the Gulf, it looked every bit as luxurious as the brochure had advertised. Our suite was on the top floor, with massive windows framing a panoramic view of the ocean. Jenna beamed with pride as she pointed out how her team had designed the resort's logo, marketing materials, and website. I had to admit, they had done an incredible job. We spent the first afternoon exploring the grounds. The resort had everything: an infinity pool, a private beach, multiple restaurants, and a world-class spa. That evening, we decided to grab dinner at the resort's most popular restaurant, a swanky place called the Continental. Unfortunately, when we got there, it was fully booked. Just as we were about to leave and try a more casual spot, a man at a nearby table waved us over. "I noticed you were having trouble finding a table," he said with a friendly smile. "My name's Dan, and this is my wife, Lisa. If you don't mind dining with strangers, we'd love to have you join us." I looked at Jenna, who nodded with a grin. "Why not?" she said. "They seem nice." So we joined them. Dan was tall, maybe a few years older than me, with an easygoing charm. Lisa, his wife, was strikingly beautiful, confident and charismatic, with long dark hair and an infectious laugh. As we sat down and ordered drinks, the conversation flowed easily. We talked about our lives, our jobs, and the resort. It turned out that Dan and Lisa had just arrived that day from Ocala and were planning to stay for a week. We shared some of the things we had discovered about the resort, and they told us about their experiences with luxury travel. It didn't take long for us to hit it off. By the time dessert arrived, I was genuinely surprised at how quickly the evening had passed. Dan was clearly enjoying our company as well and suggested we continue the night at the resort's nightclub. I looked at Jenna, who was already nodding enthusiastically. "That sounds fun," she said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. The nightclub was packed when we arrived, but Dan seemed to have some pull. He spoke to the manager, and within minutes, we had a table right near the dance floor. After ordering drinks, Dan stood up and bowed playfully. "Would you mind if I asked your lovely wife for a dance?" he asked me with a grin. "Only if I can dance with yours," I replied, smiling back. And just like that, we swapped partners. I twirled Lisa around the dance floor as the band played classic rock tunes. She was an incredible dancer, and I found myself enjoying the moment more than I had expected. Jenna and Dan looked like they were having a great time as well, and we spent the next hour switching partners and dancing to song after song. At the end of the night, as the nightclub began to empty out, Dan suggested we meet up for brunch the next morning. "We're staying in one of the beach cottages," he said, "and we'll be eating on the patio. You two should join us. It'll be fun." I looked at Jenna, who was practically beaming. "I'd love to see one of those beach cottages," she whispered to me. So, we agreed to meet them at 11 a.m. the next day. Back in our room, Jenna and I collapsed onto the bed, laughing at how the evening had turned out. "Who knew we'd make new friends so quickly?" she said, kicking off her heels. "It was fun," I agreed, pulling her into my arms. "What did you think of Lisa?" Jenna rolled her eyes playfully. "Oh, she's nice. But I saw the way you were looking at her chest. You couldn't take your eyes off her." I opened my mouth to protest, but Jenna was already laughing. "Don't worry," she said, slipping out of her dress and tossing it onto the chair. "I'm just teasing. But you could give me a little attention, you know?" Her tone turned playful as she gestured to herself. "They may not be as big as Lisa's, but I think they'll respond nicely if you give them a kiss." That was all the invitation I needed. I swept her into my arms, and we spent the rest of the night reconnecting in a way we hadn't done in a long time. The next morning, after a lazy breakfast in bed, we headed down to Dan and Lisa's cottage for brunch. Their place was even more luxurious than ours, with a private patio that overlooked the ocean. Dan had gone all out, ordering an impressive spread of food: fresh fruit, pastries, smoked salmon, and mimosas. As we ate, the conversation turned to plans for the day. Lisa mentioned wanting to sunbathe by the pool, and Jenna eagerly agreed to join her. Dan, on the other hand, had different plans. "Mark, you ever been deep-sea fishing?" he asked. "Not really," I admitted. "I've done a bit of fishing on lakes, but nothing like that." "Well, you're in for a treat," he said with a grin. "I've got a boat, 38-footer, fully stocked. Why don't you come with me? It'll be fun." I hesitated for a moment, but the idea of spending the afternoon on the open water sounded appealing. "Sure," I said. "Let's do it." After brunch, Dan and I headed down to the marina, where his boat was docked. It was a beauty, sleek, powerful, and built for serious fishing. We loaded up the gear, grabbed a cooler full of beer, and set off into the Gulf. The water was calm, the sun was shining, and it felt like the perfect day to be out on the water. We spent the first hour or so trolling for fish, but the action was slow. Still, with cold beer in hand and the sound of the waves lapping against the boat, I didn't mind. Dan told me stories about his travels and his business ventures, and it became clear that he and Lisa were quite well off. He dropped hints about their wealth, expensive properties, investments, and a lifestyle that most people could only dream of. I was intrigued but also a little envious. Just as I was beginning to wonder if we'd catch anything, my rod bent sharply. Dan sprang into action, helping me reel it in as the fish fought hard. For a moment, it felt like I had something big on the line. A marlin, maybe. But just as I was getting close, the line went slack. I cursed under my breath as Dan patted me on the back. "Don't worry about it," he said. "That's how it goes sometimes." The disappointment was short-lived, though. The sun, the beer, and the camaraderie made the day feel like a success, even without a catch. By late afternoon, we headed back to the resort, where Jenna and Lisa were lounging by the pool, looking relaxed and sun-kissed. That evening, back in our suite, I shared my fishing adventure with Jenna, who listened with a smile. But I could sense something was on her mind. After I finished my story, she took a deep breath and said, "I had an interesting conversation with Lisa today." I raised an eyebrow, curious. "Oh, what about?" Jenna hesitated for a moment, then looked at me with a serious expression. "She told me that she and Dan are into swinging." I blinked, taken aback. "Swinging? Like swinging?" "Yeah," Jenna said, nodding. Like swapping partners. She asked if we'd ever considered it. I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. The idea was so far out of left field that I didn't know how to respond. Jenna, sensing my shock, continued. Look, I know it sounds crazy, but I've been thinking. Maybe it wouldn't be the worst idea. We've talked about trying new things, right? This could be something exciting. And it's not like we'll ever see them again after this weekend. I was floored. The thought had never crossed my mind, and I wasn't sure how I felt about it. Are you serious? I asked, still trying to wrap my head around the idea. Jenna nodded, her expression serious. I am. I know it's not something we ever talked about, but I think it could be fun, and it might even bring us closer. I hesitated, torn between my curiosity and my desire to keep things simple. We had come here to reconnect, and now she was suggesting we take things to a whole new level. But as I looked at her, I realized that this might be something she really wanted. The conversation about swinging lingered in the air, creating an invisible weight between us. Jenna was looking at me expectantly, and I could see she had thought about this more than I initially realized. Part of me was surprised, another part curious. A few years ago, I would have been confident in brushing off such a suggestion, but now, things were different. Our relationship wasn't in the same place it had once been. We've had some tough times lately, Jenna said softly, leaning in. This weekend is about us, right? Maybe this could be something that brings us closer. It's not like we'll make a habit of it. I took a deep breath and leaned back on the bed, trying to think it through. On one hand, I understood what she meant. There had been distance between us recently, and this weekend had already been about stepping out of our comfort zone. On the other hand, swinging felt like stepping way out of bounds. The idea of being intimate with someone else while Jenna did the same. It was a head trip. I'm not saying we have to do it, Jenna said, her voice gentler now, as if reading my hesitation. I don't know. I feel like we've drifted apart in some ways, and this weekend has already felt like we're getting back to who we used to be. Maybe this could be part of that. I looked at her, really looked at her. Jenna had always been open-minded, adventurous, and full of surprises. Her job in PR kept her on her toes, always networking and meeting new people, always in environments where she had to adapt. I'd always admired that about her, her ability to make any room her own. I knew that the long hours and constant work had caused some of the distance between us. It had affected our intimacy, sure, but we hadn't talked much about what that really meant for us. Now here she was, offering up a bold solution, an experience that most people would never even consider. Are you sure about this? I asked after a long pause. I mean, really sure? Jenna gave a small smile, nodding slowly. I think I am. I want to do something different, something exciting. I feel like we need to inject some energy into our marriage. And this, well, it's definitely something we've never done before. The temptation to see what it would be like grew in the back of my mind. The thought of Lisa, her confident smile, the way she had moved on the dance floor, flashed in my head. And there was Dan too, clearly attracted to Jenna, but not in a threatening way. He seemed like the kind of guy who didn't need to compete for attention. It was all new, unknown territory, and that was what made it so intriguing. Okay, I finally said, surprising myself with the word. Let's try it. But only if we're both on the same page the whole time. If at any point one of us isn't comfortable, we stop. Jenna's face lit up. Deal. That evening, we met Dan and Lisa for dinner again, this time at a more intimate restaurant on the resort. There was a palpable tension between all of us, but it wasn't awkward. It was electric. The conversation flowed smoothly, though there was an undercurrent of anticipation in every word, every glance exchanged across the table. Lisa wore a sleek black dress, her hair pulled back in a way that highlighted her striking features, while Dan was laid back as always, his charm evident in the ease with which he engaged all of us. Jenna looked radiant in a red dress that hugged her figure in all the right places, and I couldn't help but admire how beautiful she was. Throughout dinner, subtle touches and flirtations started to slip into the conversation. At one point, Lisa placed her hand on my knee under the table, her fingers lightly tracing patterns against my leg, while across from me, Dan and Jenna exchanged lingering glances that said more than words ever could. It was clear that all of us were on the same page. By the time dessert came, we were ready to move on to the next step. Dan suggested that instead of going back to the nightclub, we head back to the beach cottage where they were staying. I glanced at Jenna, who gave me a subtle nod, her excitement evident. It felt like the night had been building to this moment all along. When we arrived at the cottage, the mood shifted. What had started as playful curiosity over dinner now felt like something much more intimate. The cottage was beautifully designed, with an open-plan living room that led to a private patio overlooking the ocean. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore added to the ambience. Dan poured us all glasses of wine, and we sat on the plush couches, the conversation becoming even more charged with anticipation. Lisa was the first to make a move. She leaned over, her lips brushing against mine in a gentle but unmistakable kiss. I responded, feeling Jenna's eyes on me, but not with jealousy or discomfort, just interest. Across from me, Dan and Jenna were sharing a similar moment, and soon, the lines that separated us as couples began to blur. The next few hours were a whirlwind of sensations. It was both exhilarating and surreal. There was a sense of freedom in letting go of the usual boundaries of marriage, of stepping into something entirely new. I had expected it to feel awkward, but surprisingly, it didn't. The chemistry between all of us was undeniable, and it was clear that everyone was on the same page. It felt like the walls that had built up between Jenna and me over the past year were crumbling down, not just because of what we were doing, but because of the trust and openness it required. Later, after everything had slowed down, I found myself lying next to Lisa, her head resting on my chest. I looked over to see Jenna and Dan talking softly, laughing quietly about something. In that moment, I realized that what we had done wasn't just about the physical. It was about trust, connection, and letting go of expectations. After a while, we all said our goodbyes. Jenna and I made our way back to our suite, holding hands, walking quietly but comfortably. The night had been unlike anything we had ever experienced, but it didn't feel wrong. It felt like a step forward, like something that had brought us closer, even in its strangeness. As we crawled into bed, Jenna snuggled up against me, her body warm and familiar. "What did you think?" she asked quietly. I thought about it for a moment before answering. It was unexpected, but in a good way. "How about you?" Jenna smiled, her hand resting on my chest. "I think it was exactly what we needed." The next morning, we woke up late, still feeling the effects of the night before. As we sipped coffee on the balcony, looking out at the ocean, I felt a strange sense of calm. We had crossed a line, but instead of feeling guilty or unsure, I felt a sense of renewal. It was as if all the stress, the distance, and the challenges we had faced over the past year had melted away, leaving something new in its place. We had brunch with Dan and Lisa again, but this time, there was a different kind of ease between us. The tension and anticipation from the previous night were gone, replaced by a quiet understanding. We spent the afternoon lounging by the pool, the four of us enjoying the sun and the sea breeze, talking about everything from travel plans to work to the future. There was no awkwardness, no lingering sense of what had happened the night before. It just felt like an extension of the friendship that had formed so quickly. But as the day wore on, I started to notice something in Jenna's demeanor. She was quieter than usual, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. I asked her if she was okay, and she waved it off, saying she was just tired. But I knew my wife, and something was bothering her. That evening, back in our suite, I decided to ask her again. "Hey," I said, sitting beside her on the bed. "You've seemed a little off today. Is everything okay?" Jenna sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I don't know, Mark. I guess I've just been thinking about everything." I frowned, leaning in closer. "About last night?" She nodded, biting her lip. "Yeah. I mean, don't get me wrong, I don't regret it. But I guess I didn't expect to feel so conflicted." "Conflicted how?" I asked, trying to understand. Jenna looked at me, her eyes searching mine. "It's hard to explain. Last night was exciting, and I'm glad we did it. But part of me can't help but wonder if we're trying to fix something that's broken in the wrong way. I thought it would bring us closer, and in some ways it has. But in other ways, I don't know, maybe it's just making me realize that we have more to work on than I thought." I sat back, processing her words. In a way, I understood what she meant. The night had been thrilling, sure, but it hadn't magically solved the deeper issues we had been facing. It had been a temporary escape from reality, not a solution. And now, as we sat in the quiet of our suite, the reality was creeping back in. We do have things to work on, I admitted. But we've always worked through things together, Jenna. We've been through tough times before, and we've come out stronger. This is just another challenge, right? Jenna nodded, but her expression was still troubled. I know. It's just, I guess I'm afraid. Afraid that we've drifted too far apart. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had known that things had been tough, but hearing her say it out loud made it feel more real. The thought of losing her, of our marriage falling apart, was something I hadn't allowed myself to fully confront. But now, sitting here, I couldn't avoid it. We haven't drifted too far, I said, my voice firmer now. We're still here, Jenna. We're still trying. And that's what matters. Jenna looked at me, her eyes softening. I love you, Mark. I always have. I want to make sure we don't lose what we have. I pulled her into my arms, holding her tightly. We won't. We'll figure it out. Together. That night, we didn't talk about swinging, or Dan and Lisa, or anything that had happened over the weekend. We just held each other, trying to find comfort in the familiarity of our embrace. The next day, we packed up and checked out of the resort. As we drove away, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions. The weekend had been incredible, no doubt, but it had also opened up questions and doubts that I wasn't sure I had answers to. Jenna and I were still in this together, but there was a part of me that wondered if things would ever be the same again. As we made our way back to Orlando, the conversation was light, but I could feel the weight of everything we had been through pressing down on us. We had taken a risk, tried something new, but now it was time to face the reality of what that meant for our marriage. And that, I realized, was the true challenge. It wasn't about swinging, or new experiences, or breaking boundaries. It was about us, about figuring out who we were together and how to navigate the next chapter of our lives. And no weekend getaway, no matter how luxurious, could solve that for us. But as I glanced over at Jenna, her face calm as she looked out the window, I knew one thing for sure. We were going to face it together. And that was what mattered most. The ride home from the resort was filled with a comfortable silence. The luxury getaway was behind us, and the memories of the weekend, both exhilarating and challenging, swirled in my mind. Jenna and I had ventured into uncharted waters together, pushing the boundaries of our relationship in ways I never would have imagined just a week earlier. But as we drove through the familiar Florida landscape, heading back to our regular lives, I realized that the excitement of the weekend had also brought something else into focus, the cracks in our marriage that we still needed to address. Jenna sat quietly in the passenger seat, looking out at the passing scenery. She seemed lost in thought, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of her phone. I could sense the shift in her, the internal conflict that had bubbled to the surface after everything we had experienced. I wanted to ask her what was going through her mind, but part of me wasn't sure if I was ready for the answer. Instead, I kept my eyes on the road, my mind turning over the events of the weekend. The night with Dan and Lisa had been thrilling, no doubt, but now that it was over, I couldn't help but question whether it had been the right decision for us. It had brought us closer in one sense, but in another, it had revealed just how far we had drifted. Jenna had expressed her fears the previous night, fears that we had grown too distant, that maybe this wasn't something that a wild weekend could fix. And now those fears were echoing in my own mind. The trip home seemed to stretch on forever, the miles blurring together as we moved from the serenity of the resort back to the reality of our everyday lives. I thought about our house, or rather, the house we used to have. Selling it had been one of the hardest decisions we'd made in the past year. My construction business had taken a huge hit during the economic downturn, and despite Jenna's success in PR, it hadn't been enough to keep us afloat. We had downsized, moved into a smaller place, and tried to weather the storm. Things had slowly started to improve, but the strain of those financial difficulties had left a lasting mark on our relationship. Jenna's job had kept her busy, too busy, really. Late nights at the office, client meetings, constant phone calls. It felt like she was always working, always putting her career first. I couldn't blame her for that. She had been the one keeping us from sinking completely, but it had created a distance between us, a gap that neither of us had been willing to acknowledge until recently. And that was why the weekend had felt so appealing. It wasn't just about swinging or trying something new. It was about reconnecting, about rediscovering the excitement we'd lost somewhere along the way. But now, as we headed back to the reality of bills, work, and everyday life, I wondered if we had only managed to paper over the real issues for a few fleeting moments. "We should talk," Jenna said suddenly, breaking the silence. I glanced over at her, surprised by the abruptness of her words. "Yeah," I agreed. "We should." But neither of us spoke for several minutes after that. It was as if we both knew what needed to be said, but neither of us wanted to be the one to start. Finally, as we pulled off the highway and into the quiet streets of our neighborhood, Jenna took a deep breath. "Do you think what we did this weekend was the right thing for us?" she asked, her voice tentative. I didn't answer immediately. I had been asking myself that same question since the moment we left the resort, and I still wasn't sure of the answer. "I don't know," I admitted. "It felt right at the time. It felt like something we needed." Jenna nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "I thought it would fix things," she said quietly, "or at least help us get back to where we used to be. But now I'm not so sure." I pulled the car into our driveway and turned off the engine, letting the silence settle around us again. We sat there for a moment, neither of us making a move to get out. It was as if the car had become a kind of safe space, a buffer between us and the reality waiting inside the house. "I don't regret it," Jenna said finally, "but I also don't know if it's what we needed. It was exciting, sure, but I feel like maybe it's opened up more questions than it answered." I turned to face her, searching her eyes for some clue as to what she was feeling. "What kind of questions?" Jenna looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring absent-mindedly. "I don't know. Questions about us. About what we're really doing here. We've been together for so long, and I love you, Mark. I do. But I don't know if we've really been honest with ourselves about what we need from each other." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of unspoken fears. She was right. We hadn't been honest with each other. Not about the distance that had grown between us. Not about the ways we had both let our relationship fall to the wayside as we dealt with the pressures of work, finances, and everything else life had thrown at us. "We haven't," I agreed, my voice low. "We've been avoiding it, pretending like everything was fine, when it wasn't." Jenna nodded, her eyes meeting mine. "So what do we do now? How do we fix this?" I didn't have an easy answer. The truth was, I didn't know how to fix it. We had tried something drastic, something that had pushed us to confront our desires and our boundaries. But in the end, it hadn't been a magic solution. It had only revealed how much work we still had to do. "I think we need to start by being honest with each other," I said after a moment. "Really honest. No more avoiding things. If something's not working, we need to talk about it. If one of us is unhappy, we need to say so." Jenna nodded again, but I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. "And what if that means we realize we're not as happy as we thought we were? What if being honest with each other means admitting that things are broken?" Her question hit me like a punch to the gut. It was the fear I hadn't wanted to face. The possibility that being truly honest with each other might mean acknowledging that our marriage wasn't as strong as we had believed. That maybe we had been holding on to something that was already slipping away. "I don't want to believe that," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I don't want to believe that we can't fix this. But if we're not honest with each other, we'll never know." Jenna's eyes filled with tears, and she quickly wiped them away. "I don't want to lose you, Mark. But I also don't want to keep pretending like everything is okay when it's not." I reached over and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "We're not going to lose each other. We're going to work through this. But we have to be willing to face the hard stuff." She nodded, her grip on my hand tightening. "Okay, let's be honest. Let's really talk about what we want, what we need." We sat there in the car for a while longer, holding hands and letting the weight of our conversation sink in. It was the first real step we had taken toward addressing the problems in our marriage, and though it was painful, it also felt necessary. We couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. If we were going to make this work, we had to confront the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it was. Eventually, we got out of the car and went inside, the quiet of our home greeting us like an old friend. It was strange how different everything felt now, how the weight of the weekend and our conversation had shifted the atmosphere between us. But there was also a sense of relief, like a pressure had been lifted, and we could finally breathe again. We spent the rest of the evening talking, really talking, about everything that had been weighing on us. The stress of my business, the long hours Jenna put into her job, the financial strain that had nearly broken us. It all came spilling out, things we had been holding back for too long. And as we talked, I realized that the distance between us wasn't as insurmountable as it had seemed. We had both been carrying burdens we hadn't shared with each other, and now that we were finally opening up, it felt like a bridge was forming where there had once been a gap. It wasn't easy. Some of the things we talked about hurt. There were moments when I wanted to retreat, to pull back and avoid the hard truths that were coming to the surface. But I knew we couldn't go back to how things were before. We had to face this head-on, even if it meant acknowledging the ways we had let each other down. By the time we went to bed that night, I felt exhausted but hopeful. We had a long way to go, but at least we were finally on the same page. As Jenna curled up beside me, her head resting on my chest, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in a long time. This was the beginning of something new, something harder, maybe, but also more real. Over the next few weeks, things slowly began to change. Jenna and I made a conscious effort to prioritize our relationship, carving out time to spend together without distractions. We talked more, really talked, about everything, from our frustrations with work to our hopes for the future. It wasn't always easy, and there were days when the stress of life threatened to pull us back into old patterns. But we were more aware now, more intentional about staying connected. We also made a decision to seek help. We found a marriage counselor, someone who could guide us through the tough conversations and help us rebuild the foundation of our relationship. At first, I was hesitant. I had always been the type to believe I could handle things on my own. But after our weekend at the resort and the conversations that followed, I realized that we needed support. We couldn't do this alone. Counseling wasn't a quick fix, but it was the right move for us. It gave us a space to work through the issues that had been building up over the years, and it forced us to confront the ways we had both contributed to the distance between us. There were moments of frustration, of tears, and of uncomfortable realizations. But there were also moments of clarity, of understanding, and of hope. As we moved through the process, I began to see Jenna in a new light. She wasn't just the ambitious career woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. She was also someone who had carried the weight of our financial struggles, who had fought to keep us afloat when things seemed impossible. I had taken that for granted, focusing more on my own struggles with the business and not fully appreciating the sacrifices she had made. And as I started to recognize that, I also started to appreciate her in a deeper way. Jenna, too, began to see me differently. She had always known me as the determined, hard-working man who built a business from the ground up. But she also began to understand the toll that the stress had taken on me. The fear of failure, the pressure to provide, the sleepless nights worrying about our future. In therapy, we learned to communicate those fears and stresses to each other, instead of bottling them up. One night, after one of our counseling sessions, Jenna and I sat together on the couch, talking about the changes we had been going through. It was late, and the house was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the ceiling fan above us. "I'm proud of us," Jenna said, her voice soft. I smiled, reaching for her hand. "Me too. It's been hard, but I think we're getting somewhere." She nodded, her fingers lacing with mine. Do you think we'll ever be like we were before? Before everything got so complicated?" I thought about it for a moment before answering. I don't know if we'll ever be exactly like we were before, but maybe that's not what we should be aiming for. Maybe we're supposed to grow and change. Maybe what we're becoming now is better than what we were before. Jenna smiled, leaning her head against my shoulder. I like that. I like the idea that we're growing into something new. We sat there for a while, comfortable in the quiet, knowing that we still had work to do, but also knowing that we were on the right path. The weekend at the resort had been a catalyst, a way to shake us out of our complacency and force us to face the truth. It hadn't been the answer, but it had been the spark we needed to start asking the right questions. As I held Jenna close, I realized that the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. There would be more challenges, more hard conversations, more moments of doubt. But for the first time in a long time, I felt confident that we could handle it. Together, months passed, and slowly but surely, our relationship began to heal. The intimacy that had once felt so distant started to return, not just physically but emotionally as well. We learned to lean on each other again, to support each other through the ups and downs of life. The financial strain wasn't completely gone. My business was still recovering, and Jenna's job continued to demand a lot of her time. But we were better at managing it now, better at balancing our responsibilities with our need to be present for each other. The experience with Dan and Lisa faded into the background. It became something we rarely talked about, not out of shame or regret, but because it was no longer the focus of our journey. It had been a turning point, but it wasn't the solution. The real work had been in the weeks and months that followed, in the hard conversations and the commitment to rebuilding our relationship from the ground up. There were still moments when I thought about that weekend, the excitement, the thrill of stepping outside of our comfort zone. But those moments were fleeting, replaced by a deeper understanding of what it meant to truly connect with Jenna. We didn't need to seek excitement from outside sources. What we needed was already here, between us, waiting to be rediscovered. One evening, as we sat on the porch of our new home, a modest place, smaller than our old house but filled with warmth and love, I looked over at Jenna and felt a sense of peace. We had come through the fire, and though we weren't the same as we had been before, we were stronger for it. Jenna caught me staring and raised an eyebrow. "What?" she asked, a smile tugging at her lips. "Nothing," I said, shaking my head. I'm happy. I'm really happy." She smiled, reaching for my hand. "Me too." And in that moment, I knew that we had found our way back to each other. Not by escaping into something new, but by rediscovering what had been there all along. The months that followed our return from the resort brought subtle yet significant changes to our lives. Jenna and I had committed to rebuilding what had been broken, and the process was more difficult and rewarding than I could have imagined. The weekend away had shaken us awake, revealing the fractures in our marriage, but the real work had begun once we returned home. We took things one day at a time, focusing on the present instead of worrying about the future. At first, it was uncomfortable to sit down and have honest conversations about our needs, our fears, and our disappointments. There were moments when it felt like we were on the verge of losing each other entirely. But we had agreed to be open, to stop avoiding the hard truths. And in doing so, we found a way to break down the walls that had grown between us. One of the biggest shifts came when we decided to make a rule: no work after 7 p.m. For years, Jenna's career had consumed her, with late nights and weekend projects becoming the norm. My construction business had its own demands, and it was easy for both of us to get lost in the endless grind of work. But we realized that if we didn't set boundaries, we would never truly reconnect. So, we made a commitment to leave work at the door once the clock struck 7, no matter how many emails were waiting or how many projects were left unfinished. The first few weeks of this new rule were tough. Jenna struggled with the idea of leaving her work behind, especially since her career had always been a source of pride and accomplishment. I had my own challenges, feeling like I wasn't doing enough for my business by stepping away at the end of the day. But over time, we both began to see the benefits. We had more time for each other, time to talk, to cook dinner together, to relax without the weight of work hanging over our heads. It felt like we were rediscovering who we were outside of our professional lives. Counseling helped, too. Our therapist encouraged us to focus on small, meaningful moments instead of trying to fix everything all at once. We started going on walks together in the evenings, something we hadn't done in years. Sometimes we would talk about our day, and other times we would walk in comfortable silence, just enjoying each other's company. It felt simple, but it was exactly what we needed. There were still challenges, of course. The financial strain that had plagued us for the past few years hadn't disappeared overnight. My business was slowly recovering, but it wasn't back to where it had been before the recession. Jenna's PR firm continued to thrive, but the demands of her job were always present, even with our new boundaries in place. There were days when we both felt the pressure building again, but now we had the tools to manage it. We also made a point to check in with each other regularly, asking the tough questions that we had once avoided. "How are you feeling?" became a question we asked each other almost every night. It wasn't just about surface-level emotions, but about really digging into how we were doing, both individually and as a couple. It was a way to make sure we were staying connected, even when life got busy. One evening, about 3 months after our return from the resort, we sat on the couch, enjoying a quiet night in. The TV was on in the background, but neither of us was really paying attention. Instead, we were talking about our plans for the weekend. Nothing big, just a simple dinner with friends and maybe a trip to the farmer's market. Jenna leaned her head on my shoulder and sighed contentedly. "It feels good, doesn't it?" she said, her voice soft. "What does?" I asked, turning my head to look at her. "This. Us. I feel like we've finally found our rhythm again." I smiled, resting my hand on hers. "Yeah, I think we have." It was true. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace in our relationship. There was no more walking on eggshells, no more pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. We had learned to be vulnerable with each other, to share the things that scared us, and to lean on each other when things got tough. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was what mattered. As the weeks turned into months, I started to see the changes in Jenna, too. She seemed lighter, less burdened by the weight of her career. She still worked hard. Jenna would always be ambitious, but she had learned to draw boundaries that allowed her to have a life outside of the office. She made time for hobbies she had once abandoned, like painting and photography. And more importantly, she made time for us. One night, after a particularly long week, we decided to revisit something we hadn't talked about in a while: the weekend we had spent with Dan and Lisa at the resort. It was a Saturday evening, and we were sitting on the back porch with a bottle of wine, the warm Florida breeze carrying the scent of jasmine through the air. Jenna had been quiet for a while, staring out at the stars, and I could tell she had something on her mind. "What are you thinking about?" I asked, breaking the silence. She hesitated for a moment, then took a sip of her wine. "I've been thinking about that weekend at the resort," she said slowly. I wasn't surprised. It had been months since we talked about it, but I knew it was something that had stayed with both of us, even as we worked through the deeper issues in our marriage. "What about it?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Jenna sighed, swirling the wine in her glass. "I don't regret what we did. I want you to know that. But sometimes, I wonder if we were looking for an easy fix. Like, maybe we thought that doing something exciting and out of the ordinary would solve all our problems." I nodded, understanding what she meant. It wasn't a fix, I agreed. It was more like a wake-up call. It showed us that we needed to deal with the real issues, not just distract ourselves from them.